All right, I'm here with Tweetophon back again, and we're going to be talking about just comparing our metaphysical views, so classical theism and Neo-Eleatic monism. Hopefully I got that right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I got a link in the description to like short book that he's written over his metaphysics, so you can check that out in the description. Yeah, so why don't you go ahead and share anything that you want, and then yeah, we'll just kind of trade ideas.
Yeah, like you said, this is the second time we've been chatting, so I'm glad to be back. Thanks for having me on. And as you said, I just released a new version of a text I've been working on. I've been on these internet forums and sites like Twitter, which I think is where I first encountered you, for a long time now, well over a decade at least on internet forums, maybe 2 decades now. And these debates keep going back and forth, right? And you keep retreading old ground. So the whole thing started when I figured, you know what, I'll just make a PDF and it'll be in there. And you can just point to the PDF and be like, there you go. Here's a starting point. Here's where we're kind of at. And, I was on a site called RPG Codex when I started making that PDF. Still around, still lots of debates going on there. And over time, it just grew and grew. And now I'm just trying to slowly make an actual sort of book length work out of it. It's sort of adopted a choose your own adventure style. So you can take branching paths through the discussions and sort of explore what has been termed the Eleatic temple. And you've mentioned my philosophy is neo-Eleatic philosophy. We can choose a different name if we like. It doesn't really matter the name so much, but Plato has his Neoplatonists. I like Parmenides and Zeno, Melissos, and several other pre-Socratics. So, if Neoplatonists get to use that term, I'll use Neo-Eleatics. I don't pretend to be the one true interpreter of Parmenides or anything, but he was a big inspiration for me. So that's why I chose that title. So yeah, I'm glad you're able to post the link and stuff. And if anyone is interested after hearing this, maybe they can go read it, maybe sign up for some of those forums or engage me on Twitter. And if you guys want to help write it, then jump on board. I might make a website of it one day, just because of the branching nature. You could almost do it page to page as you go through, like a website. But yeah, I don't want to cut you off if you wanted to introduce your beliefs, but I like I said, I was inspired by Parmenides and all that, and I think that this philosophy is valuable because it presents the broadest possible view. I wanted to find the broadest context. So often, and I think last time we had a discussion, it was about, what could God do? How could we relate to God, or how does he relate to the nature of existence, things like that. And it's always like one thing relating to another, or how we ought to behave in light of some edicts from some God or something. And it always seemed these questions, there's always a greater context. So for me, things like gods and people, they're limited things. I reject anyone who will say that God is unlimited, or God is omnipresent, or God is omniscient, or God is somehow can't be removed from the picture, simply because the only thing that is really omnipresent is existence. It is that greater context of just what is, that really goes beyond and contains any distinctions that we can mention. So that's why I think that the Eleatics were extremely valuable and inspiring to me, simply because they cast that net, in my opinion, wider than anyone else cast it. And when you cast the net that wide, your horizons are broader than any religion or any. Well, I don't want to criticize classical theism without you getting out the gate and mentioning something about it, but even classical theism, I think it all has to exist within a context. And here is a broader context that is superior to every other school. And every other school kind of has to bend the knee. Like, you can't have ontological beliefs or theological beliefs unless they comply with the context in which they exist. Otherwise, it's just like you may as well just say anything at that point if there's no consistency with the context of what is. And so again, the Eleatics are so valuable because they fixated on that broadest context of what is and what it means to be. And and the fact that there is no alternative to existence, and then taking that metaphysical position and really being religious about it in the sense of being, strictly obedient to that realization. And then you realize everything that flows from it, everything that is in that context, must comply with certain ramifications. And those ramifications, I believe, maybe it will come out in the discussion, maybe not, maybe you'll refute me, but I think that they eliminate pretty much every other model. I think every other model basically has to tone down its boasts, or it's just out of the game. It's done. It's not viable. And so maybe I'll let you get a word in, because I've kind of stolen the stage right now. But that's sort of my thinking of why Eleatic philosophy is so important. It's got that great context, and at the end of the day, I think if you can't beat that context, you have to comply with it. And then it's a matter of, is that system complying? Is that system complying? And if it's not, it's gibberish at the end of the day.
Yeah. So to pin down how your system works, so I know, or at least my understanding is, it's a kind of necessitarian perspective. Everything is necessary. So there's no contingency under your view?
You have to set out a whole new set of rules for contingency, because ontologically everything is necessary because of the point I mentioned, where there is no alternative to existence. Like there's not a nothing. We have to, unless someone's going to offer me an alternative to exists in the broadest sense, like it can be mentioned or perceived or thought about, there's nothing outside of that scope. So there's nothing beyond that scope. And so, yeah, everything is necessary because it all falls in that scope, and it's all permanent and inviolate and cannot be removed because there's nowhere to remove it to. But then you mentioned, does that eliminate contingency? It certainly eliminates contingency as defined or handled by, I believe, classical theism, but many other models. Do I want to keep a role for contingency? Yes, because I now have to admit that when we say contingency, let's just take, I'm assuming you're talking about possibilities like a branching chronology. Is that one type of, okay.
Yeah.
All right, so let's say we have a branching chronology. There's like a left path and a right path. You can walk down either one. If it is truly possible for you to walk down the left or the right path, then you will. It's necessary that both will occur. And so I have to posit a model where both of them occur. Now, you can experience one and not the other because you're over at the other, you're over at one. But eventually you will necessarily experience both. You'll experience the whole, like the whole picture is there. And the only way that our interactions right now make any sense is as relative. Like it makes sense to go left from a relative point in the model. But when you take the model as a whole, no, it's complete. Everything is always, meaning is complete. You can't separate moments and make them truly independent. Ontologic is truly one complete whole. But contingency exists within that whole in terms of relative points. Like there's a left path and there's a right path. They both exist. You'll go down both of them, but from a relative perspective, you can experience each one in turn. But that's sort of because that's an example of the ramification flowing from the ontological point of there being no alternative to existence. And so I think that what's really valuable about Eleatic philosophy, or the pre-Socratics generally, and certain Taoist philosophers, is you can't ignore those broader metaphysical axioms. They always have to be at the front of your mind. You have to be consistent with them because that's the context. So that's a very long way of saying, yeah, I have contingency, but I just redefined it, and now it's not going to resemble what you would consider contingency.
Right. So what is it then, under your view, that makes, like, so say the person takes the left turn and doesn't take the right turn now. Sounded like you're saying, well, eventually they'll experience going right. But what is it like in that given moment? What is it that makes it necessary? Is it ultimately like laws of physics that are necessary, or is it something else, or is it just like what's the grounding for what necessitates one event over another?
Well, are you are you now looking for a comment about free will? Like, how did we choose one
Well,
or the other?
not just free will, but just in general. Like, what is it that makes it necessary? Because like an event occurs, and you could say, well, it occurs because the person made the decision, but it didn't have to be the decision. It could be impersonal event. What is it ultimately that grounds the necessity? Is there kind of an underlying necessary stratum under this view, or
Well,
I'm just
no.
wondering what explains like the whole picture of it?
Right. The whole picture is both paths, and they're all walked down. When we're talking about how did you come to walk down the left path, we're making a judgment from a relative point inside the model, right? And so we're relatively closer to the point where you move down the left path. So you also move down the right path. It's just more distant. It's down a different branching path. They will all be expressed in the fullness of time. But from where our relative position is, because we can't put ourselves outside this model, from our relative position, these things are relatively closer. So, when you say, how you know whether you turn left or you turn right? Well, yes, there's a certain flow to existence that determines the direction that we could say the next thing will come from our relative point. And there's also our own desire or inklings at that particular point. Because we have to separate between the whole, which is the entire story, left and right, and relative points within the whole and how close they are to different points and how they move from point to point. So I think you wind up with this universal context where everything is going to happen invariably, and then these relative contexts and perspectives from within the model, like a part viewing another part of the model. And I don't necessarily object to free will in that sense. Like, my existence involves, like, there's a certain aspect to my existence that is will, and I feel certain ways about things and I want to go certain paths. So I'm not denying that exists. I mean, if you can identify something, it exists. Like, there's nothing that does not exist per se. I mean, that's incoherent. Everything exists. Free will exists to the extent that you can coherently describe something. But I think we have to draw this distinction between an observation within the model from a relative point within the model, and then the model as a whole.
Okay, so what about like a question like, how come we don't live in like a Lord of the Rings type world? And
Maybe we do.
All right, well, you'll say maybe we eventually would, or from a certain perspective, but like right now, like I don't experience like living.
Yeah, well, like you're saying, I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm just going to repeat myself in the sense that right now, you said right now we don't. Well, of course, because right now is defined as something other than that possibility. So it all winds up being this. You've taken a model that's whole, but then you've necessarily, because of our limitations, inserted us at a point, and then said, "Hey, why at this point is it not Lord of the Rings yet?" Well, of course, because this point is defined as not Lord of the Rings. It's something other than. So, that's like one. Like, of course, this cannot be Lord of the Rings because this is a limited relative observation from within a greater model. And by definition, it is other than. It's a given in this question, because the question is presuming that it is other than the Lord of the Rings scenario. Now, in the whole fullness of time, if it is possible to have Lord of the Rings on Earth, yes, it will have Lord of the Rings on Earth. And if we don't get it anytime soon, we can just wait longer. It's also possible that there is something about the Lord of the Rings story that is incoherent. When you try to actually apply it, there's something about it that is actually impossible. Like, it just doesn't make sense anymore. Like, for example, this area of reality that we're in has certain physical laws, right, that kind of determine how spatial objects move. I don't pretend to know the shape of physical reality here and understand how it all works. I'm not like a physicist or something. But the point is, I know that for an elephant to fly, it would need larger wings than a bee, right? I could tell you a story about an elephant that flies around with bees' wings. But that doesn't mean there'll come a time in this context where the physical world has this particular shape that an elephant will fly with bees' wings. Because the very shape of reality wouldn't afford it in that sense. It could only be in my imagination. Now, if somewhere else the shape is different or gravity is influenced in some other way, then sure, it could happen. But you see, it's not as fun as it is to say, yes, Lord of the Rings will happen. I suspect that there are things about the Lord of the Rings story that wouldn't conform to the shape of reality as we know it. And therefore, I would say, unless somehow the shape is different or it takes place somewhere else, the context changes in some way to allow the magic and stuff, it's not a possibility. This is just purely a fictional work in your mind. And it still exists in your mind, but it's distinct from existing in some other way.
So, from my perspective, Lord of the Rings isn't incoherent. It's just not in accordance with the physics that we have. But I think, we could have had that physics. At least it seems like we could have. But what is it that would make it, like, granting that if you're going to grant that it's impossible, and you're saying, well, maybe it's incoherent, would incoherence be the only thing that would make it impossible, or is there some like causal laws that are necessary that would make it impossible under your view?
No, I'm saying, when I say it's incoherent, it's not that it's incoherent to have a fictional story where these things are possible. So I'm not saying like the book, I've not read The Lord of the Rings. I'm not a Lord of the Rings guy, but I'm not saying that the story itself is incoherent and we can't understand it. What I'm saying is that if the Lord of the Rings story has an event that occurs, and that event doesn't conform with the shape of the reality where we want to put it, so the physical laws, because, presumably we're trying to bring the Lord of the Rings into a spatial realm and make three-dimensional characters that do certain things, well, we have to place it in some context. So we're placing it in this context that we know right now, right here. If the Lord of the Rings requires some sort of action or occurrence that is impossible under the conditions or context that we're trying to put it in, it would be incoherent to say that it happens in that context, That's all I'm saying. Or it's incomprehensible. It's like, here's the context that set the limit and the boundaries and the nature of everything. And then you're saying it also has that thing that violates all of that. Like, it can't happen. But the story itself can make perfect sense. And, if some very smart physicist comes up with some model where dragons can breathe fire and stuff and live perfectly long lives, then great. Maybe somewhere in reality, it might be possible. And if it is possible, then it necessarily is true. So I don't object to Lord of the Rings happening.
Okay.
I don't think it's going to happen in any world that I find familiar.
Yeah. So I'm just wondering, though, is it, because like I agree, given the laws of physics that we have, it doesn't seem like it's possible, at least right now, unless physics were to change. So I'm just wondering, like, that would be under my view, like what grounds it as being metaphysically possible or not would be whether or not the causal, not just the laws of physics, but basically, causal regularities would allow for it to occur. I mean, would that be your view? Or I'm just wondering if there's something else that's making something possible or impossible. And if it is something like causal laws and those causal laws are necessary, is that ultimately what determines whether something is possible or not?
Well, when I use words like allows it to happen, I can interpret it one way that I'm fine with. I can interpret another way that I would object to. Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't think I messed it.
Weird. Anyway, what I was getting at is just, when we say, does a context allow something to happen? All I'm really saying is that the context, like this thing, would not violate the context. And if it doesn't violate the context, then presumably it's necessary, it'll happen, because the context is, the chronology is whole and complete. It's not like we'll invent a new moment, like Lord of the Rings coming into life, and then create Lord of the Rings in this context where it previously was not. It already is there. Everything is whole and complete. And when we say, does the context allow for something? Allow is a fair enough word. Or maybe the context is defining everything. Everything is defined by its context, like, because it's whole. So the chronology is whole. What does a chronology contain? Well, what it contains is defined by its like what could occur in this model, which is everything, which doesn't violate it. I think maybe the clearest way to put it is it's a metaphysics of breadth, where everything is subsumed by broader things. So, everything is subsumed by beings. Everything is. And then you have all these distinct things. Everything distinct is subsumed by the idea of differences. And then you have order to these differences. Like, this thing is different from that thing in these various ways. So you have this shape of the distinctions that allows these different types of differences. And, all the range of possibilities as you go down through the context, the full range exists. And so, what is it that allows it? The fact that it's possible. I mean, if it's possible, it is. I don't see any need for allowance. It exists whole and complete. There's no, like, we'll let you in, or maybe we won't let you into the model. If you're possible, you're in. Because we can speak of you, we can perceive this notion of you, you're in. If that makes sense. Or maybe I've misspoken.
Well, kind of. I'm trying to wrap my mind around it. There was a question, maybe this will help clarify. How does it differ from idealism? And I'm taking idealism to be the idea that everything ultimately is mental, or some kind of mental experience. How would you contrast it with that?
Well, I think, so everything is a mental experience or a mental object. I suppose we'd have to define what they mean by mental. Things come in and out of my mind, right? I might have an idea, or I might perceive like this cup of tea here, or, I'll turn away and forget about it, and then I'm not perceiving the cup of tea. But the cup of tea didn't disappear. Is the cup of tea, it didn't go to nothing. There is no alternative to its existence. And then when I turn back, I'll see the cup of tea again. It hasn't re-entered existence from nowhere. So I guess I don't perceive everything as strictly a mental impression, because, one, what do we mean by mental? Do we mean like a human consciousness? Well, human consciousness is limited and things seem to come in and out of it. So I'm not going to use that as a sum total of all that is, because it appears to be informed by things beyond it. And two, I have an awareness of the tea. It's of something. It is not the thing itself. I can describe the metaphysical model to you. Maybe I do a good job of it, maybe I do a poor job of it, but I'm describing something else. It's distinct from the words I use. So I have not really engaged with many people who call themselves idealists and want to talk about mental impressions. So maybe it's my ignorance to their position that's really shining here. But I just don't see how it would be viable to go down that road. You'd have to redefine consciousness and mentality and make it broader, and I don't think it would resemble a human mind anymore.
I think maybe this could help you. Under your view, are there real, like, material objects outside of our minds that we interact with? So a kind of dualism in regards to there's consciousness, and then there are real objects. It's not just a projection.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, there's stuff out there that's distinct from from the mind. It's easy to call them physical or material, and then it's more difficult to define what it means to be physical or material, right? But I think that when you say everything is, it's no great leap to say the mind is and the physical object is, and they're distinct in some manner.
Yeah, so Mind Engine's now asking, is the mental different than the non-mental? And if so, it doesn't sound like monism. So I guess to put that in perspective, under your view, everything being monistic, is it monistic in the sense that it all is partaking of the one being? Is that correct?
Right, it's all subsumed by the whole. I mean, nothing makes any sense. Well, I shouldn't say nothing, should I? You can't really have meaning. Cannot, right? The meaning requires a whole. So when we say, is the mental different from the non-mental? What are we saying? We're saying there is mental. We're saying there is non-mental. And then we're trying to draw some sort of comparison or see if there is any sort of distinction between them. Is one other than the other? At all points, we're saying it is, it is, it is. It's all subsumed by one grand context. And so that's, to me, the monist project. It's this grand context that encompasses all that we're referencing when we say is, all that we're aware of, our awareness itself. If we're saying it is, well, take it at your face value. It is. I don't see anything beyond isness. And maybe in fairness to the person who asked the question, often I call it sort of a meme Parmenides, where they say, well, Parmenides said there's just one thing, and it's truly one thing without distinctions, and you can't say anything, and it's just like a hum with no monotone hum for eternity with no distinction. You can't say there's a car over there and there's a dog over there. It's all just one pure isness. And I've seen people tell me, hey, you can't claim to be inspired by Eleatics because you are positing distinctions within the whole or within the context of the whole. But I think that's a bit of a meme understanding that's very unfair to the Eleatics, especially because Parmenides is visited by a goddess, right? So he is carried away by daughters on a chariot to see the goddess, who then imparts truth to him and tells him of the path of truth, to always be careful to only speak of what is, because the other path of is not is just, it's incomprehensible gibberish. It's nothing. Is and is not is not. There's nothing to speak of on that other path. So I think Parmenides does acknowledge distinctions, but maybe I've misread the comment. But I just feel that when people talk about, are you a real monist, they're getting hung up on the fact that I'm saying there are distinctions within the whole or within the context of the whole. Whereas I don't have a problem with distinctions within the whole, because I'm within the whole. These are just relative distinctions of a part viewing a part within this inviolate context of the whole. But ultimately, if we were somehow able to zoom out and leave the context, which we can't, but if we did, it would be an indistinct, complete, I almost want to say it's nothing, in the sense that it's no particular thing. It's all things. It's just what is.
So what about the idea, because I think a sharp distinction between our perspectives is that I think that something can have causal powers to bring about new substances. I think God has that power, and I think consciousness itself is something that comes about. So what, under your view, would make that impossible for something to have a causal powers like that?
Well, maybe it's a good moment to I don't want to say switch gears, but maybe focus on causality and maybe put you in the answering chair for a second, because I have to ask some questions about what you think causation, or really creation here, entails. So you said, God can create a new substance. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but maybe the biggest example is the creation of the world, right? God created the world. And so when you say God created the world, I guess I need some more details from you, because what do you think creation entailed? Because for me, I could interpret it this way. I could say there's an arrangement where everything is, it's God, and, he contains the potential for absolutely everything. And then there's a next time stamp where it's an arrangement of God and there's a world off to his side. Now, being, like the ontological being, Eleatic being whole, it contains both of them. They're both absolutely necessary. They both exist inviolate. But within the model, you have this relative distinction. You have something that we consider chronologically prior, where it's just God, and maybe he's a demiurge and he has all the prime material. And then we have him having arranged it or created it in this second point. And from a relative perspective, yeah, he created it because you have this relative moment here where it was different. And he is somehow tied to the next point as he has some sort of role in this model. It's a complete story, though, and it's completely necessary. But I could see creation in that sense, and I wouldn't necessarily have too big of a problem with it. But if we're saying that second stage where the world exists literally did not exist, like it's a literal is not, then I want to see how you're defining is not or did not exist, and also discuss how it could come to be. These become ontological questions. And remember, my fundamental point is that there's no alternative to being. Being is omnipresent. Whatever you mention, it is. And there's no alternate state. So for something to be genuinely new, like to have genuinely entered the picture of what is, I'm not sure how that would happen. There's no alternate state to come from. There's no alternate state for the old state of affairs to go to. And I just want to make sure that's what you're saying and how you put it together.
Yeah, so by creation, I would mean that something wasn't and now it is. And it doesn't go from a state of existing as non-existence, because that would be incoherent. But I don't see a contradiction, though, in something just having the power to
I could pose a question that
sure.
I think would forward the discussion. What do you mean by was not or is not? So define is not. Like, what do you mean when you say is not?
Yeah, it would just mean the absence. So there is not, an apple in my hand. So it would just mean apple is absent. So, it's hard to not use the word is, but it could just mean absence of apple, absence of anything that I'm not finding in my hand.
So it's another state, though, right? There's something else. There's some other state. There's something else going on with your hand other than apple, right? So really what you've said is not absence, or if you have said absence, what it really signifies is it's something other than. So when you say there's no apple in my hand, the apple is not in my hand, you mean the apple is other than in my hand. It's in some other way. Because there's definitely meaning in what you're saying. There's some sort of significance here. You're highlighting some alternative state, or saying the apple has to have some meaning, and your hand has to have some meaning, and there's some context within it. So I don't think there's ever truly an absence in what you're saying in that example. It's just different. Is not there just seems to mean is other than, or is in some other way than. Does that make sense?
Well,
so then when you say God
in the state of an apple, yeah.
So when you said that God created the world, right? So the world is not. Prior to its creation, the world is not. If we're defining that as, the world is other than present at the time of its creation, then I can understand it. Because the world is, of course, other than at the time of its creation. It's over here. It's just at a different chronological location. But to say that it flat out is not, I don't see how that could be, because the world has meaning. You're literally saying this affirmative bit of meaning, the world, is not affirmative meaning. Like I don't see how that could be. You have to put the meaning somewhere. It will always be there. You can push it somewhere else at a different location, but if you want to assert the meaning, the world, you have to put it somewhere. You can't say that there's literally a moment where it is not in any way, you know.
Well, what about the idea that conceptually, you can have the concept of universe, but that concept doesn't apply to any concrete feature of reality until it's brought about. So if I were to say there's absence of universe, then that would just mean there is no universe, just means there just is no concrete instantiation until God causes that to come about. So it would still have meaning. It just wouldn't mean mean there's anything concrete that the concept applies to. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, it makes me think of the people who talk about potential and then actuality, right? Is that sort of the model you're hinting at, where there are these potentials or possible scenarios?
Yeah. I mean, I don't really subscribe to the idea that there like actually are potentials, but conceptually speaking, yeah, like something has the potential to bring about something else. Yeah.
Well, let's be careful with our terminology though, because you said I don't mean there actually are potentials. I just mean conceptually. I mean, in the broadest sense, you are saying there are conceptions, right? You have these different conceptual possibilities. They're distinct. You can describe them. There really is something that's being spoken of. There's meaning to your words. So I would never say that they don't really exist. They exist in the broader sense. Then you posit the distinction of there's possibilities or potentials, and then there's an actual that is, we'll say instantiated or something. And I think if we examine that model, it will run into some problems, because let's say you have all these potentials, like an idea. We'll call them conceptions. You have this conception of Earth looking like Mars, Earth looking like Venus, Earth looking like Pluto, whatever. And God picks one, right? The conception is distinct from what you would call the actual, right? Like there's a distinction here between the actual world and the conception. I mean, the actual world is Pluto and the conception of the world is Pluto, right? You're drawing a distinction there. So I'm wondering how you get the actual world as Pluto from a conception of the world as Pluto, because there's some significance or some meaning or something about the actual that is distinct from the conception. And you can't you can't place the actual wholly within the potential, because you're losing some meaning. You can't bring about new meaning. It's going to be somewhere. And so I think the actuals all have to be there always. I don't think you can, because if you eliminate them from the picture and say there's no actual world, like it's not instantiated, it's not possible, it's not here at this point in time, this is all there is. This is the sum total of existence. And it includes ideas of the world as Pluto. All right. And then you say, here's a new picture that's come onto the scene. And the world is as Pluto, and it's a spatial object, and it has been created. I say, okay, where did you get that from? Because it didn't exist here. This is lacking it. There's something significant about here that was lacking here. The arrangement is different. The nature is different. This has new information or meaning or significance that this lacked. And I wouldn't want someone to say that they could get this from this, because this lacked it. Even if it had all the ideas, it lacked the arrangement. The arrangement itself was lacking. So where are you getting it?
Well, right. I mean, there is, of course, a difference between the concrete instantiation of Pluto and just the concept of Pluto. But I guess I was drawing the distinction about the conceptual distinction to say that there is meaning in the idea of Pluto existing, even if Pluto doesn't exist, because I have that concept. But yeah, I don't think that Pluto existing, like I don't think it is derived from prior materials. Rather, it's just that there is a substance that has the ability to bring about new substances. I don't see anything incoherent in that conception.
Well, where are we? How is it bringing about new substances is what I'm confused about, because there's something in the second image where the world is created that is lacking from the old image. Right? I mean, it's literally lacking. If it wasn't lacking, it would already be in that image. Like the arrangement itself, even.
Yeah, what's lacking, though, in my mind is just the concrete instantiation. So
Yeah.
there is no difference conceptually between the concept of Pluto and the actual existing planet. The only difference is that one of them is concretely instantiated and the other one's not. But I don't think that the concrete instantiation has to already exist in order for it to still be able to be brought about. It's just that God just has the causal power to bring about Pluto.
But how would he bring about Pluto? And Pluto here signifies, we'll call it an instantiated planet. How would he bring about Pluto when Pluto literally does not exist? Like, it literally, there's no Pluto to reference. There's only a conception of Pluto to reference. There's no real Pluto to reference unless we take the whole. We take the whole chronology as being subsumed by being or isness. Then we can do it. But otherwise, where does he get the conception is distinct from the instantiation. So where does he get the instantiation from?
Right. So the conception would just exist within God's mind, but where he gets the what's needed for the instantiation, I would just say that his causal powers can just bring that about. It doesn't have to be gotten from anywhere.
Well, see, I guess I reject that, because I see that once, in my opinion, once someone has admitted that the conception is distinct from the actuality or the instantiation, or however they want to model it. I'm just going to skip to, it wasn't your words, but I'll use it as like a potential actual. So once they admit that the potential is different than the actual, I don't want them to get the actual from the potential, because the potential lacks it or is distinct from it in some way. So I don't accept anyone getting something from that which lacks it. And when I hear that, well, God could change a potential into an actual. Well, does God have it? Well, he has the power to get it. Okay, but where's it? You know, I don't see where it comes into the picture. I see the potential that is distinct from it. I see a character that says, I can make it, but I don't have it. And it doesn't exist yet. I just don't. I think that's an improper addition into the picture or into the overall scheme. I think at some point they're bringing in the actuality from things that lack it. Because if God really had it, then it already is there. Or if we take the model as a whole, it is there to be created, and these are relative distinctions from one moment to the other. But as an absolute ontology, I think what we wind up with is that we say what is not. Which, to me, it's like an is not is. It's God saying, well, I can create what's actual. I mean, I can create this actuality, but when he's saying that, the actuality doesn't exist anywhere. So it is not. But the actuality that he's speaking of has to have some significance. So it's like the thing that is not is for purposes of him speaking of it and then bringing it about. To me, I think that all these models, I think they fail horribly, just because I see them as trying to bring something out of what lacks it. And, the other angle, like, let's turn it around. What happens to the old arrangement? So you had an arrangement where it was just God. Or I don't know how, I was going to say God's just sitting there by himself, but I don't want to anthropomorphize him any more than I need to. So let's say 20 seconds after creation, Adam and Eve having a cup of tea. 30 seconds after that, Adam has finished his tea. What happened to the moment when Adam's teacup was still full? Like, what happened to that arrangement? Has that been literally ontologically destroyed, or are those old moments still there where they were? Turning it around, because we're trying to bring in new ones. Maybe we're at loggerheads there. I'm just not going to budge, and you won't. But then we turn it around and say, okay, what happened to the old moments then? So what happens to those old moments? Are they gone, or what happens to them?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of the moments, it's going to depend upon a view of time. And I mean, I'm fine with an eternalist view where, time is something or change is something we experience, but it's not necessarily something where events are coming in and out. So in that regard, it would probably be compatible with your conception.
Well, then.
But yeah, so I wouldn't necessarily say a moment goes somewhere, but certainly there are different moments that have different arrangements.
But then I reckon you're going to have another question that might cause some trouble, which is, what happened to the potentials? So, there was a potential for Adam to throw his cup of tea on Eve, right? Or for Eve to throw her cup of tea on Adam. It didn't happen. Adam drank his tea, Eve finished her tea, and they had a nice day. What happened to those old potentials? Because they can no longer be called potentials, right? In your model. Like, are they still potentials to you?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that any event within the timeline, or however you want to think about it, has causal potentials. They just are or they are not actualized. So it could eternally be the case that Adam, doesn't throw with a cup of tea, but eternally Adam has that causal power that he could potentially actualize. Just doesn't.
But you see, there's a certain significance that has changed here, because at one time he could have thrown the cup of tea on Eve and it would have resulted in a different set of events. And now those different set of events, they will never be. They're not even potentially going to be. That there's a little bit has been carved away from the potential there. It's no longer truly potential. It's just would have been potential if things went different, or if we could turn back the clock. So I think a little bit of information has been carved away there as well, or a little bit of meaning or significance. Because now I think things have gone from, it could turn out this way, to it can never turn out this way. This was just something that could have occurred from a more prior perspective, but didn't, and now is forever shut off. Is that a fair way to describe them, as forever shut off?
Possibly. I mean, in a sense, it is shut off in that the event and what is occurring within that event just eternally is the case. But I would say modally, it could have been different. So that potentiality is still a part of that event. But so I guess it just depends upon what frame of reference we're talking about. It's like I'm imagining it in the sense you have say you have a chain of dominoes, and each domino is knocking over the other one from all eternity, but each domino still has the causal potential to do something else within that eternal set. It just isn't, because it's all eternally going X when it could be going not X. So I don't know. I guess it just depends upon how you describe it. But yeah, I mean, definitely the way causality is thought of is different under an eternalist model as opposed to a presentist type, because there isn't real becoming in the same sense. But causally, though, I think the causal relation stays the same, I think.
Okay. I guess you're saying it's a relative observation, from the future it's no longer possible, but it remains as possible from that prior time, and that prior time permanently exists, I guess. I guess Well, I guess I don't want to go down that road too much. The when we say that God, how are you? I mean, what is your model of God, for example? Here, like what is it? Are you the position that God is omnipresent, omniscient, timeless, eternal, and all that stuff?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you say that God is omnipresent, you don't mean that he is literally everywhere in terms of in the essence of everything, right?
Right. I would mean it in the sense that causally he is everywhere, and like his causal power is influencing everywhere, but he's not spatially everywhere because he's not bound by space and time at all. So it's his, it's everywhere.
Well, he's not in my head or in the color red or anything like that either, right? He's it's almost like omnipresence has been reduced to omniscience or omni-awareness, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, in a sense, I would say they equate to each other. So because God causally influences everything with his intelligence, omnipresence and omniscience aren't that much different. It's just they're just different ways of describing similar features. So, his power, his intelligence, his causal influence exert over everything. So, yeah, we could say he's. Hopefully that makes sense. So basically, they're not that far apart.
Well, there's another sense of omnipresent, right? There's the one I spoke of. Omnipresent is. Everything is. There is this principle of existence that truly is omnipresence, is greater or broader than God's omnipresence. So God seems to have an inferior sort of omnipresence, right? When put against existence as a whole, a broader context. It's like a lesser omnipresence, an inferior one.
I guess it would depend upon what you mean, because like the way I'm understanding your application of omnipresence is the sense that like being is spatially everywhere as well, because just is every.
Well, your conceptions exist too, right?
Right. So I wouldn't say God is everything. So he's not, spatially everywhere, but he is causally influencing everywhere. So if you want to call that a lesser sense of omnipresence, I mean, you can say that. I would just say it's a different application because there's a different ontology. But
it's a limit, right? He doesn't infringe upon the borders or limitations of other things. You mentioned he's not spatially everywhere. Well, then he's limited to the extent that other things are spatially at locations. He doesn't occupy those locations, they do. He's limited. Okay.
Well,
and so
I don't want to say limited, but I understand what you're saying. I would say, though, it's because he's not spatially limited that he's not spatially everywhere, but it's not that there's something that's stopping him from being in a certain location. It's that not being a spatially limited thing is what he transcends the category of spatial and temporal limitations. But again, I mean, it's going to depend upon how we apply the words, I guess.
Okay, and then we mentioned that God's in your model he's omniscient, right? He knows everything. But I think earlier, if we go back to earlier in our conversation, we talked about knowledge as being of something. I think the user was Mind Onion, and he said, do you think everything is in a mental thing? And I mentioned it's, I'm aware of something, or I'm thinking of something. And so if God knows of something, his knowledge of it is distinct from the thing itself. His knowledge is always going to be inferior to the thing itself. The thing itself is what defines the truth. He might have some knowledge of it, he might understand it in some great way, but he's always distinct from it. I think God is going to be distinct from the truth in any model if the truth is the thing as it truly is. Because God is not the thing as it is. God knows of the thing, but he is not it. He is not the truth.
Right. So I would say he knows what is, but right, he's not the thing that he knows. Now, saying that he's distinct from the truth, I guess it would depend upon what that means, but
So what do you mean by truth?
Well, I would say truth is a category of basically the way that reality is. So, or the mind's understanding. So you could say the mind's conformity to reality, something like that. So yeah, I mean, in some sense, I wouldn't say God is truth, but I would say he is the source of our rationality. So he is the source of our category of truth. But yeah, it just depends upon how we cash out the words. So.
Well, I think it's important because for me, the truth in my model is what is, the way it is. That is the truth. And if we are describing something, when we say we are describing it truthfully or we've hit upon the truth, it means there's this accurate relationship between my description and the thing as it truly is. Now, I will never possess the absolute truth. I'll never possess the thing itself. It's distinct from me. But I can at least describe it and aim at the truth. But like you said just now, the truth is reality as it is. And I think God is stuck in this same boat. Only omnipresent being can actually be truth. God is sort of in the same boat we are. He's sort of aware of how things are. He might be able to describe them. And maybe, certainly in your model, he will be a lot broader and wiser and smarter than we are. But I think he's always kept at arm's length from the only real truth, which is reality itself. Does that make sense?
I mean, if truth, right? So truth under the definition of, the way reality is, then I mean, God being distinct from the other things, he would not be equivalent to all of it. So under that definition, I would agree. Yeah.
Right. So I'm wondering where we should go from here. Were you able to hear my kids calling out earlier? I think they're raging over about that. Yeah, I think I got 2 kids. I don't
even near it. Oh, so we're getting near about an hour, so I don't want to go too much past an hour. But if there was like another topic that you wanted to touch upon, then maybe we could close out with that.
I don't know. Do we have any comments?
No, we haven't been getting a ton of comments. But if anybody watching has any questions or things that can clarify,
I think I think I'm a bit.
I think he was just giving his view. But go ahead.
Is it from your perspective? Is the sort of our highest ethical goal is essentially to comply with God's wishes, right? Is that essentially what it is?
In a sense, I mean, I would say it's to conform to God's being, so to become a fully charitable and just being like God is. So I would more or less agree, but I wouldn't understand it in like a divine command theory sense, like it becomes right simply because God willed it to be, but rather, we should aim to become like God because that there simply is the best way to be. But,
morality is defined by God's will, though, right? I mean, if God wants something done, that's good by definition, right?
I wouldn't subscribe to that view. So that would be like a voluntarist divine command theory perspective. And I mean, there are theists who do hold that view. I just don't. I would say that God expresses commands that reflect his nature, but that is a set that just is the good way to be. But I wouldn't say like God could change that, or say like something this is now good because God wills it. I wouldn't say that.
So God's an eternal standard, and he also has some way of expressing the standard in words now and again.
Right. So his communications are going to reflect things that reflect his nature, but he's not going to decide his nature, or decide, now it's okay to be malicious or something. He wouldn't be able to do that.
Do you accept that do you accept that we are also sort of a more petty source of morality, in the sense that, if you see a child who is hungry and yearns for food, there's a certain desire there, and that can be a source of morality, satisfying it or impeding it. He has this direction, like his life has a certain direction. He wants to eat, he wants to grow. Do you see that as a possible basis for morality distinct from God? Because that's how I see morality. I see all these directions of change. And then, we have this overall change, like laws that govern change that we cannot resist or impede in any way. And we are kind of carried along by them. And that's, to me, a sort of a divine morality, a divine order or flow to change. But then we have our own little petty morality where we have our own life direction, like I'm eating an apple because I'm hungry. I want to get this nutrition and grow, or I want to engage in this discussion. Like I have certain excellences or directions that are not like those divine ones, which are irresistible to all, but they are still a part of the moral flow or character of reality. And so do you, where do you have a place for like a separate moral order from God? Whereas God is just an exemplar of it, or how does that go together?
Right. Well, so I would say that the desires that people have are amoral in the sense that they're not necessarily good or bad in and of themselves, but they should be respected or not in regards to a more abstract standard. So like if somebody's hungry, it is good to feed that person because that's a charitable and just thing to do, because I think people have rights to be fed and nourished and so on. But like say somebody has a really strong desire to enslave others, well, it might cause them some suffering to not grant them that. But that would be because enslaving others is not a charitable and just thing to do. So it's more, under my view, it'd be more something is moral or not if it attains this goal of achieving these greater virtues and such. And so it wouldn't be strictly about fulfilling desires, but largely desires are representative and striving towards, like, I guess the standard itself oftentimes does conform with fulfilling and meeting desires, but they wouldn't be one and the same. So hopefully that makes some sense. So I would basically say God is perfectly just and charitable, and it is moral to become just and charitable, and oftentimes that also involves fulfilling other beings' needs and such, and their desires, but not all desires are striving towards that. So that's what makes it moral or immoral.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to push too far beyond the hour, but I was just seeing to what degree your moral order is compatible with my own. My own is one of harmony. So as I was describing these, you've got these sort of irresistible flows or directions of change. And then you also have the petty ones, like, we have a certain biological direction, and just like all the other animals do. And I sort of see harmony as the highest moral order or principle, because it's bringing all of these directions in alignment, everything in its proper place, no longer infringing on one another or causing friction, and all of it being satisfied, at its proper time and its proper way. It's kind of a utopian idea, but I guess all moral orders or ideals are. And so it sounds like maybe there's a little room for our moral views to kind of come in line with each other, because it sounds like you can also value not just, well, one, God is not, issuing divine commands. The goodness is something about the way he is, and so you have to imitate the way he is to be good. And then, we have our own desires or things that develop us also seem to have some sort of moral weight in your system. So maybe you as well would want some sort of harmonious system where people live in accordance with each other and also imitate God. So it sounds like, there's at least some strong similarities there, or at least some ability to coexist. It sounds like a lot of our moral goals would at least reflect one another.
Yeah. Yeah, and if your view has any relation with like Stoicism, I don't know if it does or not, but it sounds kind of like that I would say that has some commonality. You know, Christianity is drawn upon some Stoic ideas too.
You know, it's sort of, you know, I had sort of a weird reading habit where I didn't read. I tried to avoid texts that were written after the early 4th century or mid 4th century BC, and then I kind of branched out from there. But Stoics I never really got into. But Aristotle, for example, you know, he's going to talk about the excellences of an animal and their natural direction and ways to cultivate them. So, you know, you kind of get that there. And of course, you have the Taoist texts and stuff. But I think we covered a lot of good ground. I mean, ultimately, I'm really glad that I had the opportunity to come on here. One, it got me to put in the effort to churn out another version of that text. And it also allowed me just to explain why I think Eleatic philosophy, or at least my attempt to reinvigorate it, is important, just because I think it gives a very broad, it looks to the broadest possible context. And so whether it's right or wrong, I won't weigh in on that, the viewers can, but I think it really is something worth looking into. And the pre-Socratics are always fun, right? They come up with all sorts of crazy ideas, like who was it? Is it Anaximander who said that humans were born from fish? Who because he said that the babies of humans were not self-sufficient, so they must have come from another animal that allowed them to grow large enough to fend for themselves before birthing them up on land. The pre-Socratics are wild. But yeah, thank you for letting me come on.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, and yeah, definitely be interested. Any viewers, your guys' thoughts, and then I definitely recommend checking out his text. That again, I left it in the description, and it is interesting how he says how it's kind of choose your own adventure type, and I'm still looking through it myself, so I'd be interested in others' thoughts on that. So yeah, well, thanks for coming, and yeah, I think we made some good progress. But I'll go ahead and end it there.
Thanks.